In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every shadow and survival depends on split-second decisions, the impossible happened. A woman who wasn't supposed to be there, carrying a rifle she wasn't supposed to have, made a shot that saved lives she wasn't supposed to save. They called her KIA, killed in action. The radio crackled with her death notice while smoke still rose from the building where she'd made her last stand. Command had already started writing the letters to her family. The flags were being folded. Her name was being carved into memory. But Sarah Chen had other plans. What happened next defied every rule of warfare, every assumption about limits, and every belief about what one person could accomplish when everything seemed lost. This isn't just another war story. This is the story of a sniper who walked through hell, carried 4 dying men on her shoulders, and proved that sometimes the dead don't stay dead. They just get really, really angry. The mission was supposed to be routine. The rescue was supposed to be impossible. The woman who did both was supposed to be a myth. She wasn't. Sarah Chen had always been invisible. At 5'4" and barely 130 pounds, she moved through the world like a shadow that people forgot they'd seen. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, she'd learned early that being overlooked was sometimes the greatest advantage you could have. While other kids fought for attention, Sarah perfected the art of disappearing. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke about his service, had taught her to shoot when she was 12. Not because he wanted her to be a soldier, but because he wanted her to be prepared. The world was dangerous, he'd said, and the dangerous thing about danger was how it could arrive without warning. Those Saturday mornings at the shooting range became the foundation of everything that would follow. By 18, Sarah could put 5 rounds through a hole the size of a quarter from 300 yards. By 20, she'd enlisted in the Navy and set her sights on becoming something that officially didn't exist, a female Navy SEAL sniper. The military had rules about women in combat roles, rules that were slowly changing but hadn't changed fast enough for someone like Sarah. She spent 3 years proving herself in ways that most people never would have to. Every physical test she exceeded. Every mental challenge she conquered. Every doubt about her capabilities she demolished with precision that bordered on the supernatural. Her instructors called her Ghost, not because she was scary, but because she had this uncanny ability to be exactly where she needed to be without anyone noticing how she got there. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was cleaning her rifle in the armory when Commander Jackson found her. He was a man who'd seen 30 years of military service and had the scars to prove it, both visible and invisible. When he looked at Sarah, she could see something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Not doubt, not skepticism, but something that looked almost like fear. "Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision he clearly wasn't comfortable making. "We need to talk." The briefing room was smaller than usual, with only 5 people present instead of the typical dozen. Sarah recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't a standard mission. This was something that lived in the shadows of official military operations, something that would never appear in any report that civilians would ever read. The target was a compound in the mountains of Afghanistan, about 40 miles from the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target was being held there. Someone whose capture could potentially save thousands of American lives. The problem was location, timing, and the fact that the compound was essentially a fortress built into the side of a mountain. "We've been watching this place for 6 months, explained Colonel Morrison, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. "Every approach is covered. Every angle is defended. We've lost 2 reconnaissance teams trying to get close enough for reliable intelligence." Sarah studied the satellite images spread across the table. The compound was positioned perfectly for defense. High ground, limited approaches, clear fields of fire in every direction. It was the kind of place that military strategists designed when they wanted to make sure that anyone trying to attack would die in the attempt. "What's the plan?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You," Morrison said simply. "You're the plan." The mission was designated Operation Silent Thunder, though Sarah privately thought that was the kind of name that people who'd never been shot at came up with. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its execution. A small team of 4 Rangers would create a diversion on the eastern side of the compound, drawing attention and defensive fire. While the enemy was focused on the Rangers, Sarah would approach from the west, find an elevated position, and provide overwatch. Her job was to eliminate specific targets, sentries, communications equipment, anyone who posed a threat to the Rangers' extraction. Once the Rangers had secured the high-value target, Sarah would cover their withdrawal and then make her own escape through a predetermined route that led down the backside of the mountain. "What's the timeline?" Sarah asked, though she was already calculating distances and angles in her head. "Insertion at 0200 hours, Morrison replied. "Rangers begin their assault at 0400. You should be in position by 0330. Extraction for everyone is 0600, regardless of mission status." Sarah nodded, but she was already seeing the problems. The timeline was tight, maybe too tight. The extraction window was small, which meant there wouldn't be room for mistakes or complications. And in her experience, military operations always had complications. "What about backup?" she asked. Morrison and Jackson exchanged a look that Sarah didn't like. "There is no backup," Jackson said finally. "This mission doesn't officially exist. If something goes wrong, you're on your own." The next 18 hours were a blur of preparation and mental rehearsal. Sarah stripped and cleaned her rifle 3 times, checked and rechecked her equipment, and studied the satellite photos until she could navigate the compound with her eyes closed. She practiced the approach route on a scale model built in the training facility, timing each movement until she could execute the entire insertion in complete darkness. The rifle she carried was a modified M10. 7A1, a .50 caliber sniper rifle that could put a round through an engine block at 1.5 miles. It weighed 30 pounds fully loaded, but Sarah had carried heavier things longer distances. The scope was a Schmidt & Bender with thermal imaging capability, allowing her to see heat signatures in complete darkness. But the most important piece of equipment she carried was something that couldn't be measured or weighed, the absolute certainty that she would not fail. Failure wasn't just not completing the mission. Failure was letting people die who didn't have to die. Sarah had built her entire identity around the idea that when someone was depending on her, she would not let them down. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, which should have been Sarah's first warning that things were about to go wrong. She landed 3 miles from the compound and immediately began her approach, moving through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and shred equipment. The mountain was alive with loose rock and hidden crevices, and every step had to be calculated to avoid creating noise that would carry in the thin air. It took her 2 hours to reach her position, a rocky outcropping about 800 yards from the compound's western wall. From there, she had clear lines of sight to most of the compound's defensive positions and could cover the Rangers' planned approach route. She settled into her hide, adjusted her rifle, and began the process of cataloging targets. Through her scope, the compound looked different than it had in the satellite photos. There were more guards than intelligence had suggested, and they seemed more alert than expected. Sarah counted at least 12 sentries visible from her position, which meant there were probably twice that many she couldn't see. The mission parameters had assumed maybe 6 to 8 defenders total. She keyed her radio once, the signal that she was in position and ready. The response came back immediately. The Rangers were beginning their approach. Sarah settled behind her rifle and began the careful process of selecting her first target. The plan started falling apart at 0347 hours. Sarah heard the explosion before she saw it, a tremendous crack that echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. Through her scope, she watched as a section of the compound's eastern wall erupted in flame and debris. The Rangers had breached the perimeter, but something was wrong. The explosion was too big, too bright, and it was in the wrong place. "Overwatch, this is Ranger 1, came the urgent voice through her earpiece. "We've got problems down here. This place is more fortified than we thought. We're taking heavy fire from positions that weren't supposed to exist." Sarah swept her scope across the compound and felt her heart sink. The explosion had revealed the true nature of the target. This wasn't just a compound, it was a military installation. Hidden gun emplacements were opening up, revealing heavy machine guns and what looked like mortar positions. The Rangers hadn't walked into a fortress. They'd walked into a trap. "Ranger 1, this is Overwatch," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the chaos she was watching. "I have visual on multiple targets. Beginning engagement now." Her first shot took out a machine gunner who was raking the Rangers' position with devastating fire. The .50 caliber round traveled 800 yards in just over a second, striking the target's center mass and eliminating the threat instantly. Sarah was already acquiring her second target before the first man hit the ground. Shot after shot, Sarah worked her way through the defensive positions, each round precisely placed to maximum effect. A sniper in a watchtower, a mortar team setting up behind a concrete barrier, a squad of soldiers moving to flank the Rangers' position. Each target eliminated meant the Rangers had a better chance of survival. But for every target Sarah eliminated, 2 more seemed to take its place. The compound was larger than intelligence had suggested, with more defenders and better equipment than anyone had anticipated. Worse, the defenders seemed to know exactly where the Rangers were and where they were trying to go. "Overwatch, we're pinned down," came the desperate voice of Ranger 1. "We've got wounded and we can't reach the target building. Request immediate support." Sarah could see the Rangers' position through her scope. 4 men crouched behind inadequate cover while enemy fire chewed up the ground around them. One of them was clearly wounded, his movements sluggish and awkward. They were maybe 200 yards from the building where their target was supposedly being held, but it might as well have been 200 miles.
"Ranger 1, I'm going to lay down covering fire," Sarah transmitted.
"When I do, you move. Don't stop, don't look back, just run." What happened next would be remembered by those who survived as either the most impressive display of marksmanship in modern military history or the last desperate act of someone who knew she was about to die. Sarah began what snipers call rapid precision fire, accurate shots delivered as quickly as humanly possible. In the space of 90 seconds, she fired 17 rounds and eliminated 12 targets. Every shot was perfect. Every target was a direct threat to the Rangers, and every elimination gave the ground team another few seconds of life. The Rangers used those seconds to advance across open ground that had been a killing field just moments before. But Sarah's position was now compromised. The muzzle flashes from her rifle had given away her location, and she could see enemy soldiers beginning to move in her direction. She had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her position. Maybe less if they had vehicles. "Ranger 1, what's your status?" she transmitted. "We're in the target building," came the reply, and Sarah could hear gunfire in the background. "Package is secure, but we've got company. Building is surrounded, and they're moving to cut off our extraction route." Sarah looked through her scope at the situation developing below. The Rangers had the high-value target, but they were trapped inside a building that was rapidly being surrounded by enemy forces. Their original extraction route was blocked, and every second they stayed in place made their situation worse. The decision Sarah made next would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. Instead of maintaining her overwatch position and covering the Rangers from distance, she began packing her equipment. She was going down there. "Ranger 1, this is Overwatch," she transmitted as she secured her rifle and prepared to move. "I'm coming to you. Hold position and wait for my signal." The response was immediate and predictable. Negative, Overwatch. You maintain position and cover our extraction. That's an order. Sarah smiled grimly as she began her descent down the mountain. "Sorry, Ranger 1, but you're breaking up. I can't hear you." She switched off her radio and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the safety of her elevated position to enter a hell that someone else had started but she was determined to finish. What she didn't know was that enemy forces were already moving to intercept her, that her radio silence had been interpreted by command as KIA status, and that in approximately 37 minutes, she would officially be declared dead. The last thing Sarah Chen thought as she made her way toward the compound was that her father had been right about danger arriving without warning. What he hadn't told her was that sometimes you had to run toward it instead of away from it. The descent from Sarah's sniper position to the compound took 23 minutes of careful movement through terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt it. Loose shale that could trigger a deadly rock slide, hidden crevices that could swallow a person whole, and everywhere the constant threat of enemy patrols searching for the ghost who had been picking off their comrades with surgical precision. Sarah moved like water flowing downhill, finding the path of least resistance while maintaining her momentum toward the Ranger's position. Her rifle was strapped across her back, its 30-pound weight distributed perfectly to avoid throwing off her balance. In her hands was her sidearm, a modified Glock 19 that she'd trained with until it felt like an extension of her own body. Through her night vision goggles, the compound looked like a scene from hell. Fires burned where her earlier shots had found fuel or ammunition. Bodies lay scattered around defensive positions that would never be manned again. And everywhere, the constant muzzle flashes of ongoing combat as the defenders tried to eliminate the Rangers who had penetrated their supposedly impregnable fortress. As Sarah approached the outer perimeter, she could hear voices shouting in multiple languages. The defenders weren't just local fighters. They were a mix of Taliban, foreign mercenaries, and what sounded like Russian advisors. This wasn't just a compound. It was an international meeting of people who wanted Americans dead. The outer wall was 12 feet high and topped with razor wire, but Sarah had expected this. During her preparation, she'd studied every inch of the compound's defenses and identified several potential breach points. What she hadn't expected was the patrol that rounded the corner just as she was preparing to scale the wall. 3 men armed with AK-47s and moving with the confident swagger of soldiers who believed they controlled the battlefield. They were talking quietly among themselves, probably discussing the strange sniper who had appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. They never saw Sarah pressed against the wall's shadow, never noticed the slight movement as she drew her sidearm. 3 suppressed shots fired in rapid succession. 3 men who fell without making a sound. Sarah was over the wall and moving toward the Rangers' building before their bodies hit the ground. The interior of the compound was a maze of structures connected by narrow alleys and open courtyards. Intelligence had provided a basic layout, but actually navigating it in darkness while under enemy fire was an entirely different challenge. Every corner could hide a defender. Every doorway could conceal an ambush. Every step took Sarah deeper into territory where a single mistake would mean death. She moved through the compound like a predator hunting in its own territory, using shadows and cover to remain invisible while steadily advancing toward her objective. Twice she encountered enemy soldiers and eliminated them silently. Once she had to hide for several minutes while a patrol passed within arm's reach, close enough that she could smell their cigarettes and hear their nervous jokes about the mysterious sniper. The building where the Rangers were trapped was a 2-story concrete structure in the center of the compound, surrounded by an open courtyard that provided excellent fields of fire for defenders but offered no cover for anyone trying to approach. Through the windows, Sarah could see muzzle flashes as the Rangers returned fire against enemies who seemed to be closing in from multiple directions. Sarah found a position behind a storage building about 50 yards from the Rangers' location and assessed the tactical situation. She counted at least 20 enemy fighters in the courtyard and surrounding buildings, all focused on eliminating the Americans trapped inside. The Rangers had good cover and plenty of ammunition, but they were outnumbered 5-1 and completely surrounded. The smart tactical move would have been for Sarah to find an elevated position and resume her sniper role, picking off targets from distance while staying safe. But smart tactical moves were a luxury she didn't have. The Rangers were running out of time, and every minute they stayed pinned down made their situation worse. Instead, Sarah did something that violated every rule of military engagement she'd ever learned. She stood up, stepped into the open courtyard, and announced her presence to every enemy fighter in the compound. "Hey!" she shouted in English, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "You looking for me?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Every enemy fighter in the courtyard turned toward the sound of her voice, swinging their weapons away from the Rangers' building and toward this new threat. For a moment, Sarah was the center of attention for 20 armed men who desperately wanted to kill her. That moment was all she needed. SAS sidearm bucked in her hands as she fired shot after shot with inhuman precision. Each round found its target despite the poor lighting in her exposed position. Men who had been preparing to storm the Rangers' building suddenly found themselves fighting for their own lives against an enemy who seemed to appear from nowhere and shoot with supernatural accuracy. The firefight lasted 90 seconds and consumed every round in Sarah's sidearm and both spare magazines. When it was over, 11 enemy fighters lay dead in the courtyard and the rest had taken cover or fled. The immediate threat to the Rangers had been eliminated, but Sarah's position was now completely exposed, and she was effectively out of ammunition for her primary weapon. "Ranger 1, this is your guardian angel," Sarah transmitted as she pressed herself against the nearest wall and tried to reload. "I'm in the courtyard. What's your status?" The response came immediately, and Sarah could hear the relief in the speaker's voice. "Guardian angel, this is Ranger 1. We're secure, but we've got wounded. 2 men down, 1 critical. We need immediate medical evacuation. Sarah closed her eyes and calculated odds that she didn't like. 4 Rangers, 2 wounded, surrounded by enemy forces in a hostile compound with no backup and no clear extraction route. And now they had a sniper with no elevated position and limited ammunition trying to help them escape. Roger that, Ranger 1. I'm coming to you. Be ready to move when I give the signal. Getting from the courtyard to the Rangers building required crossing 40 yards of open ground under the observation of enemy fighters who now knew exactly where she was. Sarah waited for a lull in the gunfire, then sprinted across the space like her life depended on it, which it absolutely did. She made it to the building's entrance just as several enemy fighters opened fire on her previous position. The door was solid wood reinforced with metal plates, and it was locked from the inside. Sarah pounded on it with the butt of her rifle. "Friendly's coming in!" she shouted, and heard the sound of locks being disengaged. The door opened to reveal a scene that made Sarah's heart sink. 4 Rangers, 2 of whom were clearly in bad shape. Sergeant Martinez had taken a round through the shoulder and was losing blood despite field dressings. Corporal Jackson had suffered a head injury from shrapnel and was only semi-conscious. The other 2, Staff Sergeant Williams and Private Thompson, were functional but exhausted. "Ma'am," Williams said, and Sarah could see the surprise in his eyes as he realized their guardian angel was a woman who looked like she should be in college rather than in a firefight. "We sure are glad to see you." The high-value target was a man in his 40s who looked like he'd been through hell even before the Rangers had arrived to rescue him. Michael Harrison was a chemical weapons expert who'd been captured 3 months earlier while working with international inspectors. His information about biological weapons development in the region was supposedly worth the lives of everyone who'd come to get him. "Doctor, can you move?" Sarah asked, though she was already calculating how to transport 2 wounded men and a potentially weak civilian through hostile territory. "I can walk," Harrison replied, his voice hoarse but determined. "These men risked everything to get me. I won't slow them down." Sarah looked around the room and noticed something that intelligence hadn't mentioned. The building wasn't just a place where prisoners were held. It was also an armory. Weapons, ammunition, and explosives were stored in every corner. It was a tactical opportunity that could change everything. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, shouldering her rifle and moving toward a crate of grenades, "I think it's time we leveled the playing field." What Sarah had in mind violated every principle of small unit tactics she'd ever learned. Instead of trying to sneak out of the compound undetected, she was planning to fight their way out with maximum violence and overwhelming firepower. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and completely insane. It was also their only chance. "Here's what we're going to do," Sarah explained as she distributed weapons and ammunition to everyone who could carry them. "We're going to turn this building into a fortress and make them come to us. Then we're going to make them regret it." Williams looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, we're outnumbered 10 to 1. They've got us surrounded. Fighting our way out is suicide." Sarah finished loading a grenade launcher and turned to face the Rangers. In her eyes was something that none of them had seen before. Not fear, not desperation, but absolute certainty. "Sergeant Williams," she said quietly, "I didn't come all this way just to die in this room. And I sure as hell didn't come here to watch good men die because we were too scared to fight back. So, here's what's going to happen. We're going to make so much noise and cause so much damage that every enemy fighter in this compound is going to be focused on us. Then we're going to walk out of here like we own the place." The sound of approaching footsteps and shouted commands indicated that enemy reinforcements were arriving. Sarah moved to a window and peered through the shattered glass at the courtyard below. What she saw made her smile grimly. "Gentlemen," she said, raising the grenade launcher to her shoulder, "class is in session. Today's lesson is about why you don't mess with American soldiers." The first grenade landed in the middle of a squad of fighters who were preparing to assault the building. The explosion lit up the courtyard like daylight and sent bodies flying in all directions. Before the echoes had faded, Sarah was loading another round. "Williams, Thompson, you're on the south windows," she ordered while acquiring her next target. "Martinez, you stay with the doctor. Jackson, if you can hold a rifle, you're with me on the north side." The battle for the armory building lasted 47 minutes and consumed every piece of ammunition in the room. Sarah and the Rangers turned the structure into a fortress of fire and steel, pouring such devastating firepower into the surrounding area that enemy fighters began to withdraw rather than face elimination. But victories in warfare are often temporary, and Sarah knew that their ammunition wouldn't last forever. More importantly, she could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, enemy reinforcements that would turn their small victory into a complete disaster. "Rangers," Sarah announced as she fired her last grenade. "It's time to go." The extraction plan she outlined was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would fight their way to the compound's motor pool, commandeer a vehicle, and drive through the main gate before enemy reinforcements could arrive. It required perfect timing, absolute precision, and more luck than any reasonable person had a right to expect. "Ma'am," Williams said, checking his rifle one last time. "This is either the bravest plan I've ever heard or the craziest." Sarah shouldered her sniper rifle and moved toward the door. "Sergeant, in my experience, the difference between brave and crazy is usually just timing." Outside, the compound had become a war zone. Buildings burned, bodies littered the ground, and the surviving defenders were trying to regroup for a final assault. Sarah and the Rangers emerged from their fortress like avenging angels, moving with purpose and devastating precision toward their objective. The motor pool was 150 yards away across open ground that was covered by enemy fire from multiple directions. Sarah took point using her sniper rifle to eliminate threats while the Rangers provided covering fire and helped the wounded maintain the pace. Halfway to their objective, enemy helicopters appeared over the compound's eastern wall. Sarah looked up at them and felt time slow down as she realized that their extraction window had just closed. In approximately 30 seconds, those helicopters would turn the motor pool into a killing ground. That's when Sarah Chen made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Instead of retreating or seeking cover, she stopped in the middle of the courtyard and did something that everyone who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their lives. She looked up at the lead helicopter, raised her rifle to her shoulder, and took a shot that defied every law of physics and probability. A .50 caliber round, fired from a standing position at a moving aerial target in poor lighting conditions. The helicopter exploded in midair. In the shocked silence that followed, Sarah turned to the Rangers and said simply, "Gentlemen, our ride is waiting." By the time enemy reinforcements reached the motor pool, Sarah and her charges were already racing through the compound's main gate in a stolen truck, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would be talked about in intelligence circles for years to come. The stolen truck raced down the mountain road with its headlights off, navigating by moonlight, and Sarah's perfect memory of the terrain maps she'd studied. Behind them, the compound burned like a beacon against the night sky, and the sound of explosions continued to echo off the mountain walls as secondary fires found ammunition stores and fuel depots. In the back of the truck, Sergeant Martinez was losing blood faster than the field dressings could contain it. Corporal Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, his head injury more serious than anyone wanted to admit. Dr. Harrison huddled between them, trying to provide what medical assistance he could despite his own weakened condition. Sarah drove like she'd been born behind the wheel of a combat vehicle, taking turns at speeds that should have sent them tumbling down the mountainside. But every choice was calculated, every risk was measured, and somehow the truck stayed on the narrow road despite conditions that would have challenged a professional race car driver. "Overwatch, this is base command," came the voice through Sarah's radio, startling her with its sudden clarity. "What is your status?" "We show your beacon as inactive." Sarah had forgotten about the GPS beacon that was supposed to transmit her location back to headquarters. During her descent from the sniper position, it must have been damaged or destroyed. From command's perspective, she had simply vanished from their tracking systems. "Base command, this is Overwatch," Sarah replied, downshifting as they approached a particularly treacherous curve. "I have Ranger team and package secure. 2 wounded. Need immediate medical evacuation at extraction point Bravo." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Sarah to wonder if her radio was malfunctioning. When the response finally came, it wasn't what she expected. "Overwatch, confirm your identity. We show you as KIA as of 0423 hours." Sarah glanced at her watch. It was now 0502 hours. According to official records, she had been dead for 39 minutes. The realization hit her like a physical blow. While she'd been fighting to save the Rangers, Command had written her off and probably already started the process of notifying her family. Base Command, this is Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Serial number 334-68792. I am very much alive and requesting immediate medical evacuation for wounded personnel. Another pause, this one filled with the kind of frantic radio chatter that suggested multiple people were talking at once on the other end. Finally, Commander Jackson's voice came through the static. Sarah, is that really you? Your beacon went dark 40 minutes ago. You assumed wrong, Commander, Sarah replied, taking another turn at a speed that made Dr. Bros whir. Harrison grab onto the seat. But we can discuss my miraculous resurrection later. Right now I need a medical team at Extraction Point Bravo in 15 minutes, or we're going to lose Martinez. The extraction point was a flat area about 2 miles down the mountain where helicopters could land safely. Sarah had memorized its location during mission planning, though she'd never expected to be driving stolen enemy vehicles to reach it. As they approached the coordinates, she could already hear the distinctive sound of rotors approaching from the south. But they weren't alone on the mountain road. Through her mirrors, Sarah could see headlights following them. At least 3 vehicles moving fast and gaining ground. The enemy forces from the compound had regrouped faster than expected and were giving chase. Rangers, Sarah called back to her passengers, we've got company coming up behind us. This is about to get interesting. The first shots shattered the truck's rear window, sending glass cascading over the wounded men. Sarah began weaving the vehicle back and forth across the narrow road, making it as difficult as possible for their pursuers to get a clean shot while maintaining their speed toward the extraction point. Staff Sergeant Williams had positioned himself at the truck's tailgate with his rifle, returning fire at the pursuing vehicles. Private Thompson joined him, both men trying to disable their attackers while bouncing around in the back of a speeding truck on a mountain road at night. "One click to extraction," Sarah shouted over the sound of gunfire and racing engines. "Hold them off for 1 more minute." That minute felt like an hour. Enemy rounds punched holes through the truck's body, shattered windows, and came close enough to Sarah's head that she could feel the heat from their passage. But somehow, none of the shots found vital targets among the passengers or disabled the vehicle. The extraction point came into view just as Sarah felt the truck's engine begin to sputter. They'd taken a round through the radiator or fuel line, and their transportation was dying beneath them. But it had carried them far enough. She could see the helicopter settling into the landing zone, its rotors whipping up clouds of dust and debris. Sarah brought the truck to a sliding stop just as the engine died completely. The pursuing vehicles were less than 200 yards behind them and closing fast. There was maybe 30 seconds to get everyone from the truck to the helicopter before their enemies arrived to finish what they'd started. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Martinez under the arms and helping to carry him toward the helicopter. Williams and Thompson supported Jackson between them, while Dr. Harrison stumbled along under his own power. The helicopter crew chief was already running toward them with a medical kit, his training taking over despite the obvious danger of the situation. Behind them, Sarah could hear the pursuing vehicles getting closer, and she knew they had maybe 15 seconds before the shooting started again. They loaded Martinez and Jackson into the helicopter first, the medical crew immediately beginning emergency treatment. Dr. Harrison climbed aboard next, followed by Williams and Thompson. Sarah was the last to reach the aircraft, just as the first enemy vehicle crested the hill and opened fire. "Go!" she shouted to the pilot, but the crew chief grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, you need to get in the bird." Sarah looked back at the approaching vehicles and made a calculation that surprised even her. If she got in the helicopter, it would be overloaded and would have difficulty taking off under fire. If she stayed behind to hold off their pursuers, the aircraft could depart immediately and everyone else would be safe. "Tell my family I said goodbye," Sarah said, pushing the crew chief toward the helicopter and raising her rifle toward the approaching enemies. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years afterward. Some witnesses claim that Sarah Chen single-handedly held off 3 vehicles full of enemy fighters for the 90 seconds it took the helicopter to take off and gain altitude. Others insisted that the enemy vehicles simply broke off their attack when they realized they were facing a superior force. What everyone agreed on was that when the helicopter gained altitude and turned toward base, Sarah Chen was still on the ground, still firing at enemy positions, and definitely still alive. But that's not what the official reports said. At 0534 hours, Base Command received a transmission from the extraction helicopter reporting successful recovery of Ranger team and package, with 1 KIA during extraction. The KIA was listed as Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, who had remained behind to ensure the helicopter's safe departure and had been overrun by enemy forces. At 0547 hours, a follow-up transmission reported that the extraction site had been hit by enemy mortar fire and that no survivors were possible. The coordinates were added to the list of locations that would require body recovery teams when the tactical situation permitted. At 0612 hours, Sarah Chen was officially declared killed in action, posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, and added to the casualty lists that would be transmitted to the Pentagon later that morning. The problem with these official reports was that they were completely wrong. Sarah Chen was not dead. She was, however, in a considerable amount of trouble. After the helicopter departed, Sarah had continued fighting the enemy vehicles until her ammunition ran out. When her rifle was empty, she'd used her sidearm. When her sidearm was empty, she'd used grenades taken from the compound. When the grenades were gone, she'd quite literally thrown rocks. The enemy fighters, faced with resistance that seemed both impossible and supernatural, had eventually withdrawn rather than continue losing men to a single sniper who appeared to be indestructible. Sarah had won the firefight, but victory had left her alone on a mountainside, with no transportation, no communication, and no way to contact friendly forces. Worse, she'd heard the helicopter pilot's transmission declaring her KIA. Command believed she was dead, which meant no one would be coming to look for her. She was completely on her own in hostile territory with enemies who very much wanted to find her and complete what they'd started. Sarah looked around the extraction site at the scattered equipment and abandoned vehicles, trying to formulate a plan that would get her back to friendly lines. The nearest American base was approximately 40 miles to the south, through territory controlled by Taliban fighters who were now actively searching for the mysterious sniper who had destroyed their compound and killed their comrades. She found a partially functional radio in one of the enemy vehicles and tried to contact Base Command, but got only static. Either the radio was too damaged to transmit effectively, or enemy forces were jamming communications in the area. Either way, she was cut off from any outside assistance. As the sun began to rise over the mountain peaks, Sarah Chen faced a choice that would define the rest of her military career. She could find a place to hide and wait for rescue that might never come, hoping that eventually someone would realize the reports of her death had been exaggerated. Or she could begin walking toward friendly lines, accepting the risk of capture or death in exchange for taking control of her own fate. Sarah shouldered her empty rifle, checked her remaining supplies, and began walking south. She had 40 miles to cover through enemy territory, with no support and no backup plan. But she'd accomplished impossible things before, and she was determined to do so again. What she didn't know was that her death was already making waves at the highest levels of military command. The story of a female sniper who had single-handedly rescued a Ranger team and eliminated an entire compound full of enemy fighters was exactly the kind of tale that inspired movies and recruitment campaigns. The Navy was already planning her funeral and preparing press releases about her heroic sacrifice. The Rangers she'd saved were giving interviews about their guardian angel, who had appeared from nowhere and saved their lives at the cost of her own. Dr. Harrison was preparing a report that would credit her with preventing a biological weapons catastrophe that could have killed thousands. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen was walking through the mountains of Afghanistan, very much alive and determined to stay that way. She had no idea that her death had been greatly exaggerated, or that her return from the grave would create problems that no one had anticipated. All she knew was that she had promises to keep and people depending on her, even if they didn't know she was still alive to keep those promises. The woman who had been declared dead at 061, there was about to begin the longest walk of her life, through territory where every step could be her last. But Sarah Chen had never been afraid of long odds or dangerous journeys. She'd built her entire life around the principle that when things looked impossible, that's when you started fighting harder. The sun rose over the mountains, illuminating a landscape that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Sarah adjusted her pack, checked her compass, and began walking toward home. 40 miles had never seemed so far, or so dangerous. But then again, Sarah Chen had always specialized in doing things that other people said couldn't be done. Sarah had been walking for 6 hours when she encountered the first search team. The sun was climbing toward its midday peak, turning the Afghan mountains into a furnace of rock and dust. Sarah had made good progress, covering nearly 12 miles of hostile territory while staying off the main roads and avoiding the villages where enemy fighters might be waiting. But now, as she crested a ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below, she could see her first major obstacle. 3 vehicles were parked at a checkpoint on the road she'd been paralleling. Men with rifles were stopping every traveler, checking papers, and clearly searching for someone specific. Sarah didn't need to guess who they were looking for. News of the compound's destruction had obviously spread, and bounty hunters were converging on the area like vultures drawn to carrion. Through her rifle scope, Sarah studied the checkpoint carefully. 9 men visible, probably more hidden in the surrounding rocks. Heavy weapons, including what looked like a machine gun mounted on one of the trucks. These weren't just local fighters, they were professionals, and they were prepared for trouble. The smart move would have been to find another route, to circle around the checkpoint, and add hours to her journey rather than risk confrontation. But Sarah was running out of time and energy. She'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, had fought multiple battles, and was surviving on adrenaline and determination alone. Every hour she spent avoiding conflicts was an hour closer to collapse. More importantly, Sarah had spotted something that changed the tactical equation entirely. One of the vehicles at the checkpoint was an American Humvee, recently captured based on its condition. If she could acquire that vehicle, she could cut her remaining travel time from days to hours. Sarah spent 30 minutes studying the checkpoint, learning the guards' patterns and identifying their weaknesses. They were alert but not disciplined, scanning the roads but not watching the high ground where a sniper might position herself. They were expecting their target to come to them along predictable routes, not to attack from an elevated position. The first shot eliminated the machine gunner before he even knew he was under attack. The second took out the apparent leader who was reaching for a radio. The third and fourth shots disabled the 2 men who were moving toward defensive positions with any degree of tactical awareness. In less than 15 seconds, Sarah had reduced the checkpoint's defensive capability by more than half. But she was also now committed to a fight that she had to win completely. There was no such thing as a partial victory when you were alone and outnumbered. The remaining fighters scattered for cover, but they were operating at a severe disadvantage. Sarah had elevation, concealment, and the element of surprise. More importantly, she was fighting with the calm precision of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Shot after shot found its target as Sarah worked her way through the remaining defenders. These weren't the precise surgical eliminations of her earlier missions. This was rapid-fire combat shooting designed to end the fight as quickly as possible. Each round was aimed to disable or eliminate threats without regard for ammunition conservation. When her rifle was empty, Sarah transitioned to her sidearm and began moving down the slope toward the checkpoint. The few remaining defenders were either wounded, hiding, or had fled entirely. Sarah moved through the position like a professional soldier clearing enemy territory, checking each position to ensure no threats remained. The Humvee was even better than she'd hoped. Fully fueled, mechanically sound, and equipped with communications gear that might allow her to contact friendly forces. But as Sarah climbed into the driver's seat, she discovered something that changed everything about her situation. The radio was already active, and it was tuned to American military frequencies. "Base Command, this is Reaper 6, came a voice through the static. "We have confirmation that the target is mobile in Sector 7. Request permission to expand search parameters." Sarah recognized the call sign. Reaper 6 was a special operations team that had been hunting high-value targets in the region for months. But as she listened to their radio traffic, she realized something that made her blood run cold. They weren't hunting enemy fighters. They were hunting her. "Reaper 6, this is Base Command," came the reply. "Negative on expanded search. Target is KIA as of this morning. Focus on recovering remains and sensitive equipment." Sarah stared at the radio in disbelief. Not only did Command believe she was dead, but they'd apparently sent a special operations team to recover her body and equipment before it could fall into enemy hands. The very people who should have been trying to rescue her were instead treating her as a casualty recovery mission. "Base Command Reaper 6. We have multiple reports of sniper activity in the target area after the supposed KIA time. Request clarification on target status." The pause that followed was filled with the kind of radio chatter that suggested urgent consultations were taking place at command level. When the response came, Sarah felt her world shift in ways she hadn't expected. Reaper 6, this is base command. Intelligence suggests enemy forces may have acquired target's equipment. Treat any sniper activity as hostile and eliminate with extreme prejudice. Repeat, any sniper activity in your area is to be considered enemy action. Sarah turned off the radio and sat in stunned silence. The situation had just gone from difficult to impossible. Not only was she presumed dead by her own forces, but anyone exhibiting her capabilities would now be treated as an enemy combatant. Her own skills and training had become evidence of hostile action rather than proof of her survival. She was now being hunted by both sides. The drive south in the captured Humvee was the loneliest journey Sarah had ever undertaken. Every mile took her deeper into territory, where her own forces would shoot her on sight, while enemy fighters continued searching for the mysterious sniper who had destroyed their compound and killed their comrades. At a small village about 20 miles from the checkpoint, Sarah stopped to refuel the Humvee and gather intelligence about the tactical situation. The villagers were friendly enough, though clearly nervous about the American military vehicle parked in their town square. Through broken English and hand gestures, Sarah learned that multiple military units were converging on the area. Both American and Taliban forces were flooding the region in search of something or someone important. An elderly man who spoke better English than the others approached Sarah while she was checking the Humvee's mechanical systems. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much war and too much death, but also with a curiosity that suggested he understood more about her situation than he was letting on. "You are the ghost," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "The one they are all searching for." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but the old man raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I do not wish you harm," he continued. "But you should know that both your enemies and your friends believe you are dead. This makes you very dangerous to everyone, including yourself." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Dead people have no friends," the old man replied. "Dead people have no protection under law or custom. Dead people can be killed by anyone without consequence, because they are already dead." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her official death had stripped away every protection that her uniform and nationality might have provided. She was now truly alone, with no backup, no support, and no official existence to protect her from enemies on either side. "There is a place," the old man said quietly, "where dead people sometimes come back to life. But the journey there is dangerous, and not everyone who attempts it survives." He gave Sarah directions to what he described as a neutral meeting place where representatives from various factions sometimes gathered to exchange prisoners or negotiate local truces. If she could reach this location and make contact with the right people, she might be able to prove her identity and arrange for safe return to American forces. The location was 15 miles further south, through territory that was actively patrolled by both American and Taliban forces. But it was also her best chance of ending this nightmare without being killed by her own people. Sarah thanked the old man and prepared to depart, but he stopped her with a final piece of advice that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Ghost," he said, "when you return from the dead, remember that not everyone will be happy to see you. Dead heroes are easier to control than living ones." The drive to the neutral meeting place took Sarah through some of the most dangerous territory she'd ever encountered. Twice she had to abandon the road and drive cross-country to avoid American patrols. Once she had to hide the Humvee in a cave for 3 hours while Taliban fighters searched the area with helicopters. But the most dangerous moment came when she was just 5 miles from her destination. A special operations checkpoint had been established across the only road that led to the meeting place, and Sarah could see through her binoculars that it was manned by American soldiers who would shoot her without hesitation if they identified her as the hostile sniper they were hunting. Sarah studied the checkpoint for over an hour, looking for any way to get past it without being detected. The soldiers were professionals, alert and well-positioned. There was no way to sneak past them, no way to go around them, and no way to fight through them without becoming exactly the kind of enemy combatant they believed her to be. That's when Sarah made a decision that would define her as either a hero or a traitor, depending on who was telling the story. She drove straight toward the checkpoint with her hands visible on the steering wheel and her weapons clearly secured. As she approached the barrier, soldiers emerged from their positions with rifles trained on the Humvee. Sarah could see their fingers on their triggers, could see the tension in their postures that suggested they were prepared to fire at the first sign of threat. She stopped the vehicle 50 yards from the barrier, turned off the engine, and slowly exited with her hands raised above her head. In the distance, she could hear radio chatter as the patrol leader reported contact with an unidentified individual in a captured enemy vehicle. "I am Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, United States Navy," she called out clearly. "Serial number 334-687792. I am requesting assistance returning to friendly forces." The response was immediate and predictable. Multiple rifles swung toward her position, red laser dots dancing across her chest and forehead. Sarah could see the confusion in the soldiers' faces. They'd been told to look for enemy fighters using captured American equipment, not for American personnel who'd been declared dead hours earlier.
"Ma'am, you need to get on the ground right now," the patrol leader shouted. "Put your hands behind your head and do not move." Sarah complied, knowing that any sudden movement would result in her immediate death.
As she knelt in the road with her hands behind her head, she could hear urgent radio conversations taking place between the patrol and their command structure. Her name was being repeated, her serial number was being verified, and someone was trying to figure out how a dead sailor had just walked into their checkpoint. "Base Command, this is Falcon 27, the patrol leader transmitted. "We have a situation here. Individual claims to be the KIA from this morning's operation. Request guidance on how to proceed." The silence that followed lasted for several minutes, during which Sarah remained kneeling in the road while armed soldiers debated whether she was a ghost, an imposter, or something else entirely. Finally, the radio crackled to life with new instructions. "Falcon 27, secure the individual for transport to Base Command immediately. Treat as friendly, but maintain security protocols. Command wants to debrief this personally." As the soldiers zip-tied her hands and loaded her into their vehicle, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She was finally going home, but she wasn't sure what kind of reception would be waiting for her there. The dead, she was learning, were not always welcome when they tried to return to the land of the living. The ride to Base Command took 47 minutes and passed in complete silence. Sarah sat in the back of an armored vehicle, her hands zip-tied behind her back, watching familiar landscape roll past through bulletproof windows. The soldiers who had captured her maintained professional courtesy but kept their weapons ready, clearly uncertain whether they were transporting a hero or a security threat. At Forward Operating Base Rhino, Sarah was processed like a returned prisoner of war rather than a rescued American service member. Medical examination, psychological evaluation, and extensive debriefing by intelligence officers who seemed more interested in what she might have revealed to enemy forces than in how she'd managed to survive when everyone believed her dead. "Chief Petty Officer Chen," said Colonel Morrison, the same man who had briefed her on the original mission 36 hours earlier. "You've caused quite a stir in the intelligence community. According to our records, you died at 0612 2 hours yesterday morning." Sarah looked around the sterile briefing room where she'd been questioned for the past 6 hours. Maps covered the walls, showing the compound she'd destroyed and the route she'd taken to reach friendly forces. Red pins marked locations where she'd engaged enemy forces, while blue pins showed confirmed enemy casualties. The tactical analysis made her journey look like a textbook example of special operations warfare. "Sir, I understand there was some confusion about my status," Sarah replied carefully. "But as you can see, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Morrison smiled grimly and opened a thick folder filled with documents, photographs, and what looked like official reports. "Confusion is one word for it. Let me tell you what your death accomplished in the past day and a half." The story Morrison told was simultaneously inspiring and disturbing. News of Sarah's heroic sacrifice had already reached the Pentagon, where senior officials were preparing congressional testimony about the courage of American service members. The Navy was planning a memorial service that would be attended by the Chief of Naval Operations. Harrison had submitted a report crediting her posthumously with preventing a biological weapons catastrophe. "More importantly," Morrison continued, "your actions at the compound have been classified at the highest levels. The intelligence gathered from that operation is now part of ongoing counterterrorism efforts that could save thousands of lives. Your official death helps maintain operational security around those efforts." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Sir,
Are you suggesting that my survival is somehow problematic? Morrison closed the folder and looked directly at her. Chief Chen, you've accomplished something remarkable. You single-handedly destroyed a major enemy installation, rescued 4 American personnel, and provided intelligence that will reshape our operations in this region. Under normal circumstances, you'd be receiving the Medal of Honor and probably have a movie made about your exploits. But these aren't normal circumstances, Sarah said, beginning to understand the complexity of her situation.
Exactly.
Your official death serves multiple purposes that your survival complicates. It provides cover for ongoing operations, protects classified methods and sources, and has already become a powerful symbol for military recruitment and public relations. Sarah stared at Morrison in disbelief. Sir, are you telling me that the military would prefer that I remain dead? I'm telling you that your resurrection creates problems that no one anticipated when we declared you KIA, Morrison replied. Problems that affect operational security, ongoing missions, and classified programs that extend far beyond this single operation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Jackson, who entered the briefing room carrying another folder and wearing an expression that Sarah had learned to associate with bad news. Colonel, Jackson said, we've received new intelligence about the compound our friend here destroyed. It wasn't just a holding facility for prisoners. It was a major logistics hub for biological weapons development. The destruction of that facility may have prevented an attack on American soil that could have killed tens of thousands of people. Morrison nodded as if this information confirmed something he'd already suspected. Commander, please brief Chief Chen on the full scope of what her actions accomplished. What Sarah learned in the next hour fundamentally changed her understanding of the mission she'd thought was a simple rescue operation. The compound she'd destroyed had been a central node in a network of facilities developing biological weapons for terrorist organizations. Dr. Harrison hadn't just been a prisoner. He'd been working undercover to gather intelligence on the weapons program before his cover was blown. The 4 Rangers weren't just there to rescue a civilian, they were there to extract an intelligence asset, whose information was critical to preventing multiple terrorist attacks. Sarah's intervention hadn't just saved 5 lives. It had potentially prevented a catastrophe that could have killed thousands. The problem, Morrison explained, is that all of this information is classified at levels that restrict who can know about it, how it can be used, and what kind of recognition can be provided to the people who made it possible. Sarah felt the weight of implications settling on her shoulders. So my survival is classified too. Your survival is complicated, Morrison replied. We need to find a way to acknowledge what you've accomplished while maintaining the operational security that your official death provides. The solution Morrison proposed was elegant in its complexity and disturbing in its implications. Sarah would remain officially dead, but would be quietly reassigned to a classified program that didn't officially exist. She would continue serving her country in ways that could never be acknowledged publicly, performing missions that would never appear in any official record. Think of it as a second chance, Morrison said, an opportunity to serve at the highest levels of national security without the constraints of normal military bureaucracy. Sarah listened to the proposal with growing unease. Everything Morrison was describing sounded like the kind of black operations program that existed in spy novels but not in real military organizations. Soldiers who were officially dead but actually performing classified missions for unnamed government agencies. Sir, what you're describing sounds like I would disappear from official records permanently. Sarah said, my family, my friends, everyone I've ever known would believe I was dead. Morrison nodded gravely. That's correct. It's one of the sacrifices that this level of service requires. But consider the alternative. We could arrange for your miraculous survival to be discovered, but the resulting security reviews and media attention would compromise ongoing operations and potentially cost lives. The choice Morrison was offering wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah could remain dead and serve her country in ways that would never be acknowledged, or she could return to life and potentially compromise operations that could save thousands of lives. How long would this assignment last? Sarah asked. As long as your country needs you, Morrison replied, or until circumstances change enough that your return to official life becomes possible. Sarah sat in silence for several minutes, weighing options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. Her survival had created a problem that couldn't be solved by normal military procedures, and the solution being offered required sacrifices that went far beyond anything she'd ever imagined. "I need some time to consider this," Sarah said finally. Morrison nodded and stood to leave. "Of course. But Chief Chen, you should know that while you're considering our offer, you're still officially dead. Which means that leaving this facility without authorization would make you a security risk that would have to be eliminated." After Morrison left, Sarah was escorted to quarters that were comfortable but clearly under constant surveillance. She had a bed, a desk, basic amenities, and no freedom to leave or communicate with anyone outside the facility. For the next 3 days, Sarah wrestled with a decision that would define the rest of her life. She could accept the assignment and disappear into the shadow world of classified operations, serving her country in ways that would never be acknowledged. Or she could refuse and face consequences that Morrison had made clear without stating explicitly. On the 4th day, Commander Jackson visited her quarters with news that changed everything. "The Rangers you rescued have been asking questions," Jackson said. "They want to know what happened to their guardian angel, and they're not accepting the official story about your death. Martinez especially. He says he owes his life to someone who can't be dead because she promised to get him home." Jackson handed Sarah a letter that had been intercepted before being mailed to her family. It was from Staff Sergeant Williams, describing her actions in detail and requesting that her family be informed about how she'd saved his life and the lives of his team. "These men are heroes," Jackson continued. "Their testimony about your actions is already creating pressure for a full investigation into the circumstances of your reported death. The story is getting attention at levels that we can't control or contain." Sarah read Williams' letter and felt something she hadn't experienced since walking out of the compound: hope. The Rangers she'd saved weren't willing to let her sacrifice be forgotten or classified into obscurity. They were fighting for her recognition even though they believed she was dead. "There's something else," Jackson said. "Harrison has submitted a formal recommendation that you be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. That recommendation has reached the Secretary of the Navy, who has begun asking questions about the details of your death. The situation that Morrison had tried to contain was unraveling. Too many people knew too much about what Sarah had accomplished, and the official story wasn't holding up under scrutiny from people who had the authority to demand answers." "What does this mean for me?" Sarah asked. Jackson smiled for the first time since she'd met him. "It means that sometimes the right thing to do and the practical thing to do turn out to be the same thing. We're going to bring you back from the dead, Chief Chen, officially and with full honors." The process of resurrection took 2 weeks and involved more paperwork than Sarah had thought possible. Her death was officially attributed to a clerical error compounded by communications failures during a complex operation. Her survival was credited to superior training, exceptional resourcefulness, and what the official report described as actions above and beyond the call of duty in the face of overwhelming odds. The ceremony where Sarah was officially returned to the land of the living was held at the Pentagon and attended by senior officials from across the military establishment. She was awarded the Navy Cross, promoted to Senior Chief Petty Officer, and assigned to a new position that allowed her to use her skills while remaining within official channels. But the moment Sarah remembered most clearly from her return to official existence wasn't the ceremony or the awards. It was when the 4 Rangers she'd saved were escorted into the briefing room where she was meeting with her new commanding officers. Sergeant Martinez, his arm still in a sling from his wounds, was the first to speak. "Ma'am, we just wanted to say thank you, and to let you know that we never believed you were dead. Heroes don't die that easy." Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward and handed Sarah something that made her eyes fill with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. It was a photo of the 4 Rangers standing together outside a military hospital, all of them alive and recovering from their wounds. On the back, someone had written, "Our guardian angel, who kept her promise." "Chief Chen," Williams said quietly, "we don't know what happened after you stayed behind at the extraction point, but we know you made it out alive, just like you promised. And we want you to know that as long as we're around, no one's going to forget what you did for us." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of her fellow service members, people who had believed in her when official records said she was dead, who had fought to bring her back from bureaucratic oblivion, who understood that some promises are too important to be broken by paperwork or classified operations. "Rangers," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I told you I'd get you home.
But you're the ones who brought me home.
The woman who had been declared dead at 061 2 hours on a Tuesday morning in Afghanistan was finally, officially, and permanently alive. She had walked out of hell carrying 4 wounded men on her shoulders, had survived being hunted by both sides in a war, and had proven that sometimes the difference between dead and alive is just a matter of refusing to accept what other people tell you is impossible.
Sarah Chen had always been good at being invisible when she needed to be.
But she had learned something else during her journey from death back to life. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to disappear when people are counting on you to be there. The mission was complete. The promise was kept. The guardian angel had earned her wings. They declared the SEAL sniper dead. Minutes later, she walked out with 4 Rangers alive.